Night watchmen, or security guards as you might prefer to call them, are people who accumulate surprising stories, full of both good and bad moments. It's true that many times their nights pass peacefully in the silence of the early hours. But what happens when that calm is shattered by something completely out of the ordinary and terrifying? Good evening, Dom. My name is Lorenzo. I'm writing to share something that happened to me years ago while I was working as a night watchman. I'm not sure how to classify what I experienced, but I hope that by sharing it, I might find some answers. What I'm about to tell you, I don't exactly know how to categorize. Without a doubt, it involves the paranormal, but what exactly happened to me, whether it was caused by someone or some force, I simply don't know. I hope that by sharing this, someone who understands what occurred might comment and help me clarify things. I worked as a night watchman at an accounting office in downtown Bogota, in a small 4-story building. It was the kind of place that, even at night, was in a somewhat busy area. I had never faced dangerous situations, break-ins, or anything like that. In fact, the entrances were protected by metal gates, impossible to get through without attracting attention. I was allowed to take short naps during my shift. Every night around 2 in the morning, I would take a brief rest of about 30 minutes, maybe an hour. My watch post was secure and I felt confident that nothing would happen. Until one night, everything changed. I woke up abruptly from one of those naps to something I had never experienced before but had heard about. Sleep paralysis. I was sitting in the chair, leaning against the wall, with my feet propped up on a small stool, completely unable to move. I couldn't move my hands, feet, or even my head. In the midst of that panic, I noticed a man, seemingly young, no older than 25, standing outside my glass booth. He was inside the building, just a few steps away from me. His expression was strangely mocking. He looked absolutely normal, with nothing about him that would make me think he was something supernatural. At that moment, I thought he might have drugged me, perhaps caused me to inhale some sort of chemical substance to incapacitate me while planning to rob the place. But none of it made sense. Why hadn't the alarms gone off? And how had he gotten in? Struggling against the fear and the immobility, with my head pressed against the wall and my eyes locked on him, I saw the man open his mouth and say, "Aren't you going to get up?" Then he laughed. His laughter echoed down the hallway to my right as he walked away, disappearing from my sight. As soon as he was gone, I felt my body return to normal. I immediately called a colleague on the radio, requested backup, and alerted them that someone had broken into the building. I grabbed my equipment and headed toward the direction where I heard a door slam. I clearly saw the door closing. It was the maintenance storage room. The hallway lights were on, and I knew I wasn't imagining things. It all felt very strange. Those small rooms, no more than 2 meters by 2, were solely used for storing items. I ran over, quickly opened the door, and found nothing but an empty room. Still, I decided to investigate. I looked around, searching for any possible openings, but there weren't any, not even a window. It was while I was inspecting the space that I heard that laugh again. This time, though, the sound came from behind me. The problem? Behind me there was only a wall. That's when it hit me. No living person had entered that place that night. Terrified, I bolted out of that storage room, heart racing, and returned to the booth, making the sign of the cross. I reported everything to my colleague. I felt relieved to confirm it wasn't a thief. He would have seen something on the cameras if that were the case. But at the same time, I felt a chill run down my spine. That meant I hadn't imagined any of it. Everything really happened. The rest of the night was tense. I didn't need coffee to stay awake. Fear kept me on edge. I stayed in the booth, trying to distract my mind with the television until dawn, but always glancing at the window out of the corner of my eye, hoping not to see that man again. Many people say that spirits, or what we commonly call ghosts, don't have the ability to induce sleep paralysis. Perhaps what caused my experience was something else, something that left my body in that state. It could even have been a natural phenomenon. However, I can't ignore the fact that the paralysis disappeared the moment I lost sight of him. Will I ever understand what happened that night? Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. I never knew the full truth about how I came into this world. If it weren't for my grandparents, who decided to reveal it years later, I might still believe my childhood was as ordinary as anyone else's. Good evening, Dom. My name is Anna Victoria. When I was only 2 years old, I lost my parents and was raised by my paternal grandparents, Don Angelo and Doña Nuria, in a small town called San Juan de los Lagos, in Jalisco. From an early age, they raised me according to the traditions of the Catholic faith. I was baptized in the village church, learned to pray, and we attended Mass every Sunday, always maintaining a peaceful and affectionate routine. However, since I was a child, I had dreams I couldn't explain. In many of them, I saw a distant woman watching me. She was thin, with long, dark hair, always dressed in black. I tried to approach her several times, but could never see her face. When I told my grandfather about these dreams, he explained that the woman was my guardian angel. He said God chose an angel for each person even before they were born, and that angel protected us throughout our lives. At the time, I was 7 years old and believed everything my grandfather told me. I began to pray every night, asking that woman to take care of my parents wherever they were and to tell them how much I missed them. Things changed when I turned 9. I started seeing figures that seemed to belong to another world. Some looked like ordinary people, while others had frightening features and gazes that caused a fear I couldn't explain. I told my grandmother about this, and she said they were angels sent by God. Despite trying to believe her, something inside me told me it wasn't true. Those beings looked nothing like the angels described in church. There were nights when these episodes became even more intense. On one occasion, I heard a strange sound in my room, like someone chewing something. I called my grandparents, who searched the entire room but found nothing. My grandfather decided to stay with me that night. While trying to comfort me, he began to talk about my mother. It was the first time anyone had mentioned her. According to him, my mother was an extraordinary woman who loved me deeply. But in the family, no one else spoke of her. I had no photos of her and only knew my father's face from an old picture my grandfather kept. The strange events continued. One night, while doing my homework, I heard noises coming from the closet. Summoning courage, I opened the door, but it was empty. Shortly after, I felt my blanket being pulled as I tried to sleep. It was as if a small figure was trying to climb onto my bed. When it finally succeeded, I saw that it was a tiny being, resembling an old man but no bigger than a doll. I froze with fear, unable to move or scream. He slowly approached my face, and the malicious smile he gave made me let out a scream. My grandparents rushed into the room. My grandmother hugged me, trying to calm me, while my grandfather searched the place. They found nothing, but this time they didn't say it was my imagination or an angel. They just exchanged a look that at the time I couldn't understand. After much insistence, they let me sleep in the guest room that night. In the following days, it seemed like things had finally calmed down. My grandparents intensified their prayers, and my grandmother placed a blessed rosary in my new room. For a while, I believed all of it was behind me. But one night, as I slept soundly, I felt that malevolent presence again. Before I even opened my eyes, I sensed something was wrong. A constant sound echoed through the room, like something being dragged across the floor. I tried to move, but it was as if my body was trapped, awake but unable to react. The noise grew louder, and I felt a slight weight beside my head. With great effort, I opened my eyes and saw it again. That little man standing next to my bed, with the same sinister smile as before. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He put his finger to his lips, signaling for silence while holding something in one hand. It was a small bell whose sound seemed to penetrate walls, echoing unnaturally. Soon, shadows began to fill the room. They were vague forms with disfigured faces, emerging from the corners and floating around me. Some came so close I could feel the biting cold of their presence. I don't know how long this lasted before the bedroom door suddenly opened. My grandmother entered first, with an expression of fury I had never seen. Right behind her was my grandfather, holding his cane firmly. At the sight of them, the creature let out a high-pitched scream and darted to a corner of the room. My grandfather tried to strike it with his cane, but it passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. Even so, the creature reacted with anger, and its screams attracted more shadows that began to surround my grandparents. The scene was utter chaos. My grandmother prayed loudly while my grandfather bravely tried to protect us with whatever he could. Suddenly, the small creature lunged at them with terrifying speed. My grandfather tried to fight it but fell to the floor during the struggle, clutching his chest. My grandmother, though exhausted, kept praying with an intensity I had never heard before. Finally, the creature disappeared, but not without leaving behind a chilling laugh that echoed throughout the house. I ran to my grandfather, who lay on the floor. My grandmother tried to help him, but his condition was critical. Not knowing what else to do, I went to call our neighbor, Doña Eva, who was very close to our family. Her son answered, and upon hearing what was happening, rushed over to help. He called an ambulance, but by the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. My grandfather had suffered a heart attack. That night changed everything in my life. Losing my grandfather left a massive void in our family, but at the same time, it brought to light a truth my grandmother could no longer hide. After the funeral, she called me to her room. With a serious expression, she opened an old wooden box and took out something that completely changed how I saw everything I had experienced. A photograph of my mother. For the first time, I saw her face. She had the same green eyes as mine, and her expression exuded a mix of strength and mystery. With tears in her eyes, my grandmother said it was time for me to know the whole truth. According to my grandmother's account, my mother was a woman of remarkable uniqueness, but her path became shrouded in the darkness of witchcraft. Initially, she was sought out for her abilities in healing and spiritual cleansing rituals. The villagers believed she had a rare gift for helping those in need. However, at some point, my mother delved into darker practices, seduced by promises of power and protection. My grandmother said these choices brought tragedy to our family. The first to be affected was my father. He was strong, healthy, and full of energy, but began to mysteriously fall ill. He lost weight rapidly, lost his appetite, and within a few months, an aggressive cancer took his life. Consumed by guilt and fear, my mother withdrew from everything, leaving me in the care of my grandparents. That was the last day anyone saw her. My grandmother also confessed that after my mother's disappearance, she began having dreams in which my mother asked her to protect me. She claimed that dark forces would come after me to settle the debts she had left behind. This was why my grandparents decided to strengthen their faith even further. They baptized me and raised me under God's protection. After hearing all this, many things that had previously been incomprehensible started to make sense. The strange figures I had seen since childhood, the unexplainable noises in my room, and especially the presence of that small malevolent being. My grandmother explained that these phenomena were direct consequences of my mother's choices and the enemies she had made during her life. The most frightening realization, however, was understanding that these dark forces had not disappeared, but were still seeking revenge. In the weeks that followed, my grandmother worked tirelessly to find ways to protect us. Although she was a devout Catholic, she turned to Doña Pilar, a respected healer in the village. Despite not believing in these practices, her desperation to save me drove her to try. According to Doña Pilar, from the moment I was born, my mother had left a mark on me, a sort of trace that allowed dark entities to locate me. She explained that even by leaving me in my grandparents' care to protect me, my mother couldn't entirely sever the connection. To ward off these forces, Doña Pilar performed several spiritual cleansings in our home. Using herbs and prayers that seemed to resonate through every corner, she tried to purify the environment. She also gave me an amulet that I was to carry with me at all times. These measures provided some relief, but didn't completely eliminate the phenomena. The shadows still appeared from time to time, although with less intensity. On one particular night, as I lay in my room, I was once again overtaken by that cold, oppressive feeling, as if the air around me had grown heavier. I woke up startled and looked toward the window, where I saw a shadow larger than the others hovering in the air. Its form was undefined, but its eyes glowed an intense red. I was paralyzed, unable to move as it slowly approached. At that moment, I remembered the amulet hanging around my neck. I gripped it tightly and began to pray, even though I knew only a few words. The shadow hesitated for a moment, but didn't disappear. It remained there, motionless, watching me, as if it were waiting for something. The next morning, I told my grandmother what had happened. Her expression was one of deep concern, and that very afternoon we returned to Doña Pilar's house. The healer greeted us with a serious look, as if she already anticipated the reason for our visit. After hearing my story, she explained that the malevolent spirits were intensifying their efforts because they knew their time to reach me was running out. Despite the strong spiritual protection surrounding us, according to her, it was not unbreakable. Donna Pilar proposed a more elaborate ritual, something that would require total commitment. Without hesitation, my grandmother agreed, and the preparations began that same night. The ritual was conducted in the main room of our house. Donna Pilar drew symbols on the floor using salt and ashes, while my grandmother and I held lit candles. The words she pronounced, in a firm and almost otherworldly tone, sent chills through my body as if each sound carried a powerful energy. During the ritual, the room became noticeably colder, the candle flames flickered, and shadows began to form around the circle Donna Pilar had drawn. Although they didn't cross the boundary, their presence was suffocating. At one point, one of the candles suddenly went out, and the amulet around my neck began to heat up, lightly burning my skin. Sensing the intensification of the forces around us, Donna Pilar raised her prayers until, gradually, the shadows dispersed. Despite the apparent success of the ritual, Donna Pilar was emphatic in saying that the battle was far from over. According to her, as long as I was alive, these forces would not give up, as my existence represented debts left behind by my mother. She advised us to remain vigilant and continuously reinforce our spiritual defenses. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy calm. The shadows appeared less frequently, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being constantly watched. My grandmother placed amulets in every corner of the house and taught me to pray with greater dedication. Although I tried to maintain a normal routine, the fear lingered, like a constant presence at the back of my mind. This false tranquility, however, didn't last. One night, while I was home alone, I heard that familiar sound, the creaking from my closet. This time, fear didn't paralyze me. Holding the amulet in one hand and a lit candle in the other, I slowly approached. I opened the door abruptly, ready for anything, but at first, I saw nothing. When I crouched to look closer, two small, glowing eyes stared back at me from the depths of the closet. It was the same small creature I had seen before, but this time, its gaze was filled with hatred. Before I could react, the creature lunged at me with astonishing speed, striking my chest with force. I was thrown backward, the candle slipped from my hand, and it went out as it hit the floor, plunging the room into complete darkness. Feeling intense pain in my chest, as if the blow had left an invisible mark, I struggled to catch my breath. The sound of the creature's claws scratching the floor echoed around me, and fear nearly immobilized me. Even so, I knew I couldn't give up. Too weak to run, I began crawling toward the door, desperately searching for any source of light. As I reached the doorframe, a sound behind me made me freeze. It was a whisper, laced with mockery. When I turned my head, I saw that small creature again, now standing in front of my closet, holding something that looked like a tiny bell. However, when it rang the bell, the sound that echoed was deafening, as if it were summoning something beyond my comprehension. Suddenly, the shadows began to take over the room once again, but this time with sharp contours. Their faces were distorted, their gazes brimming with hatred, and they no longer lingered as before. They now advanced toward me with clear intent. I tried to pray, but my voice was stifled, as if something was tightening around my throat, silencing me. It was then that the front door burst open. My grandmother, who had arrived earlier than expected, heard the commotion and ran to my room. As soon as she opened the door, the light from the hallway flooded the space, and the shadows hesitated for a moment. However, the small creature remained motionless, as if the light didn't affect it. My grandmother entered with determination, wielding a large wooden cross she had brought from the church. Without hesitation, she began praying loudly, and her strength was something I had never witnessed before. The small creature reacted with fury, dropped the bell and lunged at her, but the cross seemed to repel it. A piercing scream filled the room, and it retreated, vanishing into the closet along with the shadows. My grandmother came to me, helped me to my feet, and continued praying as we both left the room, still gripped by fear. We locked the door, and that night, she concluded that we could no longer face this alone. The next morning we sought out Donna Pilar once more. When we recounted what had happened, she showed genuine concern. According to her, that creature was a vengeful spirit, an emissary of dark forces seeking to reclaim something they believed was rightfully theirs. Donna Pilar explained that in her final days, my mother had performed a desperate ritual to protect me. However, this act only intensified the entity's anger. The solution she suggested was a complete exorcism of the house, something that would require the involvement of an experienced priest. However, she warned that not all priests would agree to perform such a ritual. Though hesitant, my grandmother agreed to try. In the following days, we managed to contact Father Marcos from a nearby village, known for dealing with cases of possession and paranormal phenomena. When he arrived at our house, his presence immediately brought a sense of serenity and strength. There was something about him that filled every space with security. He walked through every room, holding a rosary and murmuring prayers as he examined every detail. When he reached my room, he suddenly stopped. He said that an extremely intense energy was concentrated there, something neither natural nor benevolent. The exorcism began at dusk. We gathered in the living room, my grandmother, Donna Pilar, and I, while the priest prepared. He placed blessed candles in the four corners of the room and drew a cross with holy oil on the door. Then he began reciting prayers in Latin, his firm voice reverberating throughout the house. At first, everything remained calm, but it didn't take long for the same shadows to start appearing. They floated through the room as if trying to intimidate him. The priest, however, showed no sign of hesitation. Suddenly, the shadows began concentrating on a single point: the closet. From there came the sound of the bell, accompanied by a deep, animalistic roar that seemed to make the walls vibrate. The closet door violently burst open and the small creature emerged, its gaze even more filled with hatred. It tried to attack the priest, but it was repelled by the cross he held aloft while chanting a powerful prayer. The creature screamed, its inhuman voice echoing through the room. The confrontation dragged on for what felt like an eternity. The shadows tried to attack multiple times, but the priest remained steadfast, driven by faith and determination. Finally, the being dissolved into the air and the shadows slowly vanished. When it was over, a profound silence filled the house. Father Marcos remained in the living room softly praying, while my grandmother and I tried to process what had just happened. Donna Pilar was gathering the remnants of the candles and the amulets used in the ritual. Despite the room feeling lighter, I knew this wasn't a definitive ending. The priest warned us that although the ritual had succeeded in banishing the creature and the shadows, these forces might attempt to return. He recommended keeping the house continually blessed and ensuring I always wore the protective amulet. My grandmother, ever faithful, agreed, but I could sense that the fear still lingered within her. In the weeks that followed, peace reigned in the house. For the first time in a long time, I was able to sleep without interruptions, and the days passed without the strange events that had once been part of my routine. However, something inside me remained unsettled. The words of Donna Pilar and Father Marcos echoed in my mind. The mark I carried, my mother's legacy, connected me to that dark world, and I couldn't convince myself that it was truly over. One night, while alone in my room, I decided to open an old wooden box where my grandmother kept a photograph of my mother. As I searched through it, I found objects I had never seen before: a black beaded rosary, a small notebook filled with mysterious symbols, and a letter addressed to my grandmother. When I opened it, I recognized my mother's handwriting. In the letter, she described how she had tried to protect me before disappearing. She confessed that in a desperate attempt to save my father, she had turned to dark practices. According to her, the doctors had no solution, and someone offered her an alternative, but at a high cost. My father passed away shortly after, and the consequences of that pact began to haunt her. That's why she decided to leave me with my grandparents, trusting that their faith would be enough to protect me. What chilled me was reading that my mother knew I had inherited her gift, the ability to see and sense things others couldn't. In the letter, she begged me never to use this gift and to stay away from that dark world, as these abilities were precisely what the malevolent entities sought to exploit. Even without fully understanding what she described, her words confirmed everything Donna Pilar and Father Marcos had said. After reading the letter, a sense of oppression filled my chest, as if something invisible was watching me. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. That night, as I slept, I had a dream so vivid it felt real. I saw my mother at the foot of my bed. She remained silent, but her eyes were filled with sorrow. She reached out to me, and just as I tried to touch her, I woke up in a panic. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but something felt different in the room. There were no shadows, but the air felt heavier, charged with an oppressive energy. I sensed she was trying to warn me about something I couldn't yet understand. The next day, I told my grandmother about the items in the box and the dream. Her concern deepened, but she said very little. She only asked me not to mention anything to Donna Pilar or Father Marcos, as if she feared they might know something that should remain hidden. That same day, we went to church for a special mass in memory of my grandfather. During the ceremony, I once again felt the sensation of being watched. When I looked to the back of the church, I saw a figure almost concealed in the shadows. It was the small being with the same mischievous smile. My heart raced, but when I blinked, it had vanished. We returned home in a whirlwind of emotions. I didn't know if I should tell my grandmother what I had seen, but I decided to keep it to myself. Later, while praying in my room, I heard the distant sound of the bell again. Something inside me told me this wasn't over yet, that the forces around us were waiting for the right moment to strike again. The following days were tense. Despite trying to distract myself, the constant feeling of being watched didn't fade. The nights were even worse. Although the figures and shadows were no longer visible, I could feel their presence lingering in the corners of the house. My grandmother seemed to sense it too, though she wouldn't admit it. Her way of praying had changed. It was more intense, almost desperate. One night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the familiar creak of the wardrobe. My body froze, and for a moment I thought about calling my grandmother, but something stopped me. I felt that this time I needed to face whatever was in my room. I got up slowly, clutching the amulet around my neck, and approached the wardrobe. When I opened the door at first, I only felt an unbearable chill. But then, from the dark depths, the small being emerged. Its smile was more sinister, and in its hands it held a small antique mirror. It lifted the mirror, and my reflection began to distort within the glass. I felt as though something was pulling me inside, as if my own image was being sucked in. I tried to move away, but it was as if my body was paralyzed. Suddenly, a loud sound came from the bedroom door. It was my grandmother, realizing something was wrong. She entered, holding a blessed candle in one hand and a large wooden cross in the other. Seeing the small being, she began to pray fervently, but this time it didn't retreat. It seemed stronger, as if it had gained power over time. The mirror in the creature's hands began to emit a pale glow, and I immediately felt my strength draining away. My grandmother, noticing my state, rushed to me and pressed the cross against my chest. The contact with the cross brought a warmth that gave me enough energy to pull away from the wardrobe. At that moment, the small being let out a piercing scream that echoed through the house. As my grandmother continued to pray fervently, the creature disappeared into the mirror, which fell to the ground and shattered into thousands of fragments. Despite its absence, we knew the danger still lingered. My grandmother, exhausted, was gasping for breath, and I trembled with fear. We decided to call Donna Pilar immediately. When she arrived, she examined the shards of the mirror and confirmed our suspicions. That object had been a portal, a direct connection to the world of shadows. Donna Pilar insisted that we needed to perform one final ritual to permanently seal any remaining connection with these forces. She warned us, however, that this ritual would not be easy. We would have to confront, once and for all, the entities that haunted us. My grandmother agreed without hesitation, and I, though terrified, knew there was no alternative. The next night in our backyard, everything was prepared. Donna Pilar traced a circle of salt and ashes around us, placing black candles at each cardinal point. Holding the amulet that had belonged to my mother, she began to chant prayers in an unfamiliar language. The air grew dense, and a cold wind blew, extinguishing the candles one by one. Then it appeared again. The small being had returned, but this time it was accompanied by larger shadows that filled the yard with their oppressive presence. Donna Pilar intensified her prayers, and my grandmother and I joined her, gripping each other's hands tightly. The shadows charged at the circle, but the barrier of salt and ashes held them back. The small being approached, stopping at the edge of the circle, holding what appeared to be a fragment of the broken mirror. It raised the shard and began reciting words in a strange, dark language. The shadows around us writhed violently, and I noticed that the protective barrier was beginning to weaken. Donna Pilar, with an even firmer voice, lifted my mother's amulet and uttered one final powerful prayer. An intense light emerged from the circle, illuminating everything around us. The shadows twisted, blinded as the small being screamed in fury before vanishing completely. When the light faded, the yard was engulfed in silence. The shadows had disappeared, and the mirror fragment the being had held had turned to ashes. Exhausted but relieved, Donna Pilar confirmed that the ritual had been successful. However, she reminded us that my connection to the spiritual world would remain. She said I would always have this sensitivity, but as long as I stayed away from dark practices, I could lead a relatively peaceful life. That night, my grandmother and I hugged tightly, aware that we had faced something that almost destroyed us, but also knowing we had overcome it together through faith and courage. In the weeks that followed, the house felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. Everything seemed different, as if the home had regained its essence. My grandmother and I returned to our routine, but with the understanding that we would never be the same. Every corner of the house bore the marks of what we had faced, but also a sense of victory. Donna Pilar continued to visit, inspecting the amulets and reinforcing the protections to ensure the balance we had achieved would be maintained. Although everything seemed to have ended, something inside me remained uneasy. The shadows were gone, and the small being no longer manifested, but I still felt echoes of the past, a subtle remnant of what had occurred. I didn't tell my grandmother to spare her from worry. I decided that if anything happened again, I would face it alone. One day, while helping my grandmother clean the house, I found an object I had almost forgotten, the small notebook with symbols that had belonged to my mother. As I flipped through it, I saw drawings and notes written in an unfamiliar language, interspersed with passages in Spanish. Some spoke of protection and balance, while others mentioned sacrifices and pacts, sending chills down my spine. Amid the pages, one name repeated itself several times: Ixchel. My curiosity led me to ask Donna Pilar about it. She explained that Ixchel was a Mayan deity associated with the moon, healing, and, in certain traditions, magic. According to her, my mother had sought the help of this goddess, though the details of their connection remained unknown. This discovery stirred a mix of admiration and fear toward my mother. Although she had made grave mistakes, I began to understand that her choices were often driven by love and desperation. I decided to keep the notebook, safeguarding its contents in secret. I knew it symbolized a powerful connection to my mother, but also a door to something I wasn't ready to face. I hid it in a safe place, away from my grandmother's eyes or anyone else's. Over time, I returned to school and tried to lead a normal life. I made a few friends, but never shared what I had experienced. Many in the village already knew rumors about our family, and I preferred not to fuel more stories. Even so, there were days when this semblance of normality felt fragile, like a mask about to fall. I knew my spiritual sensitivity would never completely disappear, and that, at any moment, I might feel again what I had once feared so deeply. One night I had another dream about my mother. This time she wasn't standing at the foot of my bed, but sitting beside me as if trying to comfort me. In the dream, she held my hand and said something I will never forget. "I'll always be with you, but don't let my past define you. You have the power to decide who you want to be." When I woke up, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was the last time I dreamed of her. Years passed, and although I still carry this connection to the spiritual world, I've learned to live with it. My grandmother remained my greatest source of support, praying for me and teaching me to face challenges. Donna Pilar became more than a spiritual guide. She became a dear friend to us. I chose not to follow in my mother's footsteps, even though I inherited her gift. I understood that my path didn't have to be the same. Instead, I focused on building a life far from the chaos that marked my childhood. I found solace in the faith my grandmother instilled in me and in my inner strength. Today, looking back, I recognize that every experience, no matter how terrifying, shaped who I am. The shadows, the small being, and all the challenges taught me to value life and the people around me. Although my journey has been difficult, I found peace in embracing my identity and taking control of my own destiny. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. My name is Ramon. It was at the age of 34 that I experienced something that changed my perception of the supernatural. Until then, stories seemed to be just that, stories. But when you face something like this personally, everything takes on a whole new dimension. At the time, about 10 years ago, I was working as a night watchman at a printing press located on a busy road. The building was single-story but extended far to the back. All entrances were reinforced with metal shutters, secured by iron bars and padlocks. Any attempt to open one of them would make a loud noise, which made the place quite safe. That's exactly why the experience of that night left such a deep mark on me. I would do rounds even though it wasn't necessary, just to pass the time and stay awake. Usually I walked through the corridors listening to the radio or, when my phone was charging, browsing the internet. That day I was returning from the bathroom, and as I turned into a corridor, I saw something that froze me to the core. There she was, standing in the middle of the corridor, as if she knew I would walk through there. It was a woman. I was paralyzed. There was no reason for anyone to be inside that building, much less someone like her. Her clothes, a light blouse, shorts, and sandals, were completely soaked in a red liquid. It looked like blood. Her body was covered in wounds. My heart started racing, but I grabbed the radio and, without taking my eyes off her, called for help, reporting the situation and requesting an ambulance. As I did so, my hands were trembling so much that I dropped both the keys and the radio on the floor. When I bent down to pick them up, a chill ran through my body as I noticed she was just a few inches away from me. Her presence felt suffocating, as if the air around me had grown heavier. I only saw her feet, covered in blood and motionless, but I couldn't comprehend how she had moved so quickly, covering more than 6 meters without making a single sound. I remained frozen. Then her feet began to retreat slowly. When I finally mustered the courage to stand up, I looked around and she was no longer there. I checked the floor, searching for any sign of blood or footprints, but there was nothing. On the radio, my colleagues were asking me to unlock the doors because a patrol car was on its way to assist her. But no ambulance managed to arrive as the nearby streets were blocked. I replied that it was no longer necessary. I didn't explain much about what had happened. I was confused and terrified. To this day, I don't fully understand what I saw in that corridor. I returned to my small room, and my colleague over the radio informed me that the streets were blocked. He suggested that I step outside to make myself visible to them and the police, making it easier for them to approach. I did as he said. I unlocked the iron bars and raised the metal shutters. Outside, just a few meters away, near other buildings and houses, there was commotion. Curious and unwilling to stay inside the building, I approached to understand what was going on. That's when I saw her. There she was, the same woman I had encountered minutes earlier in the corridor. This time she was lying on the asphalt, motionless. They hadn't yet covered her body with that white sheet used for those who have passed away. It was her without a doubt, the same clothes, the same hair, the same face, but now completely covered in blood. From what I could tell, she had been the victim of a car accident, thrown through the windshield. I still wonder how I didn't hear anything. I was so close. Perhaps the radio volume was too high, or the closed doors muffled the sound. But none of that explains how she appeared to me earlier inside the building, even though she had already passed away outside. To this day, I can't comprehend it. Beyond the shock, I felt a deep sadness. I can't imagine what she went through, and although I was terrified, I believe her intention in appearing to me wasn't to frighten me. It was that night that I truly understood, through personal experience, what it means to see a ghost. Around here, we often hear stories about crisis apparitions. They're tragic events, marked by unexpected farewells. They say these phenomena occur when the soul, or whatever essence remains of someone, tries to interact with the physical world in their final moments. It's common to hear that these apparitions appear to close acquaintances, either to say a final goodbye or to deliver some kind of message. But what about when they appear to a complete stranger? Could it be an act of desperation, as if they're seeking someone, anyone, to witness their pain or final moments? Perhaps the term crisis itself explains it. In 1997, while I was working as a night watchman at the Mexican Social Security Institute here in Michoacán, something unforgettable happened. For prudence, I prefer not to specify exactly which unit it was. That year, more precisely in June, we received a patient who was gravely injured from a fall down a ravine. She was in a delicate condition, with multiple injuries across her body. However, there were two that posed a serious threat to her life. One on her skull, which caused significant brain trauma, and another on her spine, leaving her paralyzed from the neck down. My job involved long 24-hour shifts, giving me moments of quiet after the hospital's daily activity wound down, with doors locked and the staff reduced to a minimum. One of those nights, a young woman around 18 or 20 years old appeared asking for the way out. I showed her the path since the main entrance was locked. Her presence intrigued me, but I assumed she was someone accompanying a patient. She then mentioned she wanted to buy a bottle of water. There was a vending machine nearby, so I walked her there. While she got her water, we chatted a bit. She explained that she was there to take care of the patient who had arrived after the accident, since the family didn't have anyone else available. The explanation made sense. At the time, I didn't strictly monitor who came in or out to accompany patients. For several nights, our interactions repeated. Sometimes she was the one at the hospital. Other times it seemed to be an older woman, perhaps alternating shifts in caregiving. Still, I never questioned her relationship with the patient. Our conversations were brief and didn't go beyond simple topics, like where we were from. 15 days went by. Despite all efforts, the injured woman didn't make it and passed away. Due to renovations in the ICU, she was kept in an isolated room. It fell to me to handle her body, following the procedures to hand it over to her family. That was when something deeply marked me. When I uncovered her face, I froze. It was the young woman I had spoken to so many times during those nights. Shortly after her parents arrived to claim the body, there was no one else who could have resembled her. I later learned that she didn't have any sisters, only her parents. I almost revealed what had happened, but felt it wasn't the right moment. I never saw that young woman at the hospital again. Only then did I realize that the woman I had spoken to, night after night, was the patient herself, who could never have gotten out of bed, let alone walk the halls. She left the hospital on a stretcher, already lifeless. And you? Have you ever experienced anything like this? Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. Good evening, Dom. I prefer to tell this story anonymously. When I left college, I found myself unemployed. There was a promised job due to my involvement in community service, but I would have to wait 6 months to start. Meanwhile, I began looking for other options, and during that time, a friend managed to get me a night watchman position at a funeral home near the local IRS offices. I'd rather not give more details about the location, as what happened there is sensitive. Honestly, I never really knew who owned the place, but when you hear what occurred, it will become clear why this mystery matters. I accepted the job. There weren't many requirements, it was straightforward, and it even came with a few perks, like being able to nap at night if needed. My friend, who had previously worked there as an embalmer's assistant, was the one who recommended me. That embalmer had moved on to another place and took my friend with him, but they stayed in touch with some of the people there. That's how he heard about the vacancy and told me, and I've never been easily frightened. And the funeral home, besides being private, didn't belong to a large chain. It looked like an old residential house, spacious and well lit, which made me comfortable enough to accept. After all, I needed the money, and the job seemed simple: spend the night, do some rounds, and that's it. After a few days of training with the afternoon shift guard, which basically consisted of learning about the keys and entrances, my first night alone arrived. I vividly remember what the colleague said to me, a serious but attentive man. "From now on, you'll be alone here. Nothing will happen. It's safe. Everything is locked. There's an alarm. And if anything happens, the police arrive quickly. So far, that's never been necessary. But there's one thing. When you're walking around at night, ignore everything and everyone. Don't pay attention, no matter who or what it is, inside or outside. Don't listen and just keep walking." I thought it was some kind of joke for rookies, but coming from him, it was strange. He was kind yet formal and not the type to joke around. I decided to ask directly if he was talking about supernatural things. He replied, "Your friend didn't mention it. Here, sometimes they show up. During the day you don't notice because people are around. But at night, yes, they're souls coming to say goodbye. Sad scenes. Just ignore it. Turn up the volume on the TV or radio, stay in the office. If someone breaks in, the alarm will go off, but don't worry. It's just a scare. Remember, act like you don't hear anything." Although I felt a bit uneasy, I'm not someone who scares easily. Besides, the salary was very good, and I knew the owner was quite wealthy, something my friend had mentioned. I figured that even if something supernatural happened, it wouldn't affect me. The first 2 nights were uneventful. The job even felt boring. Few cars passed by the street, and the silence in the place had a peculiar quality. I always played music or left the TV on. Not that the silence bothered me, but inside that building it felt strange. Maybe it was the acoustic insulation of the funeral home structure, but apart from that, nothing out of the ordinary happened. On the 3rd night, I was leaning near the front door, looking outside through the glass, mostly out of sheer boredom. That's when I heard from the 2nd floor the sound of something tapping on a window. It was light tapping, like someone asking to come in. At first, I dismissed the idea of it being a real person and thought it might be a tree branch, but I stayed alert. A few minutes later, the tapping repeated, exactly the same way. I didn't move to check, still convinced it was just a branch. The next night, as I began my shift and locked everything up, I crossed paths with some embalmers working in a nearby building, separate from where I was stationed. Once the place was completely empty, I went to finish my last rounds. That 4th night was completely silent, but suddenly I heard footsteps coming from the back of the building. They were slow, but in that absolute silence, every sound felt amplified. I assumed someone was still around and walked in that direction, calling out, "Good evening, we're closed. Is someone there?" The footsteps continued, leading me to one of the chapels. When I reached the entrance, which had no door, I saw the space was pitch dark. In the dim light, I could clearly make out someone walking, but I couldn't see who it was. A chill ran down my spine. Without stepping inside, I stayed at the entrance, trying to find the light switch with my hand, and asked, "Who's there?" As soon as I spoke, the footsteps stopped. Immediately, a child's voice, clear and distinct, answered, asking me to come in. I swallowed hard, hesitating, until the same child's voice said something different, that I should run. Before I could react, I heard heavier footsteps, like those of an adult, rushing towards me. Instinctively, I stepped back, and the footsteps quickened, forcing me to run down the corridor. When I glanced back, I saw a boy emerging from the darkness, chasing me while laughing. He followed me until veering into another room. Shaking, I tried to rationalize. "Who is this boy? He must be with someone." I grabbed the radio and informed the security manager that there was a child inside the building. I explained that the alarm hadn't gone off, which seemed even stranger. While reporting, I went to the room where the boy had entered but found no one. The colleague on the radio told me to stay calm and mentioned that it might be the hauntings they were aware of. He checked the cameras in real time but said he didn't see anything and couldn't access the recordings at that moment. He simply asked me to return to the office. Before I left, he asked me a question that made me even more uneasy. "Do you see a mirror at the back of the room? And that cloth on the floor? Put the cloth back over the mirror. Didn't they explain that the mirrors need to stay covered?" I looked around and saw a mirror hanging on the wall with a cloth lying at its base. While putting the cloth back, he explained that it was a funeral home tradition to cover the mirrors at closing time because that was when things inside them could escape. Still on the radio, I kept talking to distract myself, but as I adjusted the cloth on the mirror, I saw in the reflection the same boy running towards me from the doorway. I spun around instantly, letting out a scream, but he wasn't there anymore. On the other end of the line, my colleague insisted, "And cover the mirror now, don't turn off the light and get out of there." That night I had to leave. I walked to a nearby convenience store and texted my friend. Even though I knew I was disturbing him since he had to wake up early, he replied. He said we'd talk in the morning as he lived near me. I returned to the funeral home, locked myself in the office, and left the TV on maximum volume. If anything else happened that night, I simply didn't notice. The next morning, he picked me up, we went out to eat, and I told him everything that had happened. I said I was upset that he hadn't warned me about such frightening things. He explained that he thought the guard had already told me everything. He also mentioned it was strange no one had said anything about the mirrors, since they were supposed to be covered at night. What he shared next made me even more uncomfortable. To me, it's something as delicate as it is reckless, not to mention a terrible reflection on the owner of the place. According to my friend, this story was told to him by the embalmer who had worked for the owner for years. The owner had an obsession with mirrors and filled the funeral home with them, even though he knew, according to beliefs, mirrors shouldn't be present at wakes. It's said that they can trap the souls of the deceased. Not only did he know this, but he was fully aware of the manifestations occurring there, to the point that he avoided stepping foot in the funeral home at night. For this reason, the employees were required to cover all the mirrors at the end of the day to prevent anything from escaping. After many wakes, these mirrors became charged, having seen too much. Then, the owner sold them to people who knew exactly what they were buying, mirrors with dark histories. They paid high prices, but no one knew exactly what they did with them. At that moment, everything made sense. What I saw and heard, that boy who chased me, wasn't my imagination. The mirror had been uncovered, and that's when the apparition occurred. I don't know how many other things might be hiding in the dark rooms, but one thing I knew, there were many mirrors in that place. After that, I couldn't keep working there. I felt it was an absolute disrespect, aside from the fear that something worse could happen to me. So I simply decided not to go back. I understood that there's a market for absolutely everything, but I wonder, how do these people find out who sells such objects? Mirrors that witnessed farewells, marked by the pain and emotions of grieving families, by the resentment and anguish of final words spoken. What happens to the souls trapped in them? And what do those who buy them do with them? Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.